Oh, good evening, everyone. Welcome to our first Monday session for PPA 660. I hope your week is off to a good start. It was really nice seeing everyone on Saturday. If you weren't able to attend our Zoom session on Saturday, the session was recorded. The link is up there on our Canvas site. All we did on Saturday is we just reviewed the syllabus and we reviewed the course requirements, and that was about it. So it was kind of a short morning. I think we're in and out there in just over an hour. So tonight obviously will be a little bit longer than that because tonight we're going to start getting into some of our substantive information for the course. And the primary topic that we'll be talking about tonight will be an introduction to organization theory. We'll talk a bit about what organization theory is. We'll talk about why we study organizations. We'll talk about what aspects of organizations we study. We'll also talk about some of the differences between studying public versus private organizations and provide a good rationale and a good justification for why this course is a required course in the DLMPA program as well as in our stateside program, and why a course like this is pretty much a staple course in the vast majority of NASPA accredited NPA programs around the country. So as I told you on Saturday, what I like to do with this class is I usually like to spend the first half of our class session together, kind of doing the material, what I call the lecture, going over the material, talking about these different concepts, and then we'll take a break. And then in the second half of the class, we will then turn our attention to what I like to call the lab portion of the class, where I will put you into breakout groups, and then each group will then work on an assignment applying this information then to your given organization. So that's kind of the approach that we'll take tonight. We'll see how we progress. In terms of length of the class, it'll probably take us a couple hours to get through that information, and then that will be the extent of what we're doing tonight. Before we get into that material tonight, though, just a reminder, your first graded Canvas essay is due next Monday. And for that Canvas essay, what you'll be doing is just sharing with us the organization that you plan to use as the topic, the focus for your organizational analysis paper. And so you, again, do not have to use your organization if you're not comfortable doing so. Vast majority of people tend to use their own organizations because they're most familiar with those organizations, but you don't have to if you're not comfortable doing that. But in the Canvas essay, just tell us what organization you are focusing on, and then just give us a little bit of background in terms of the purpose and the functions of that organization. So just be sharing that with your colleagues in discussion board. Uh, like I had said, you get full credit on these Canvas essays. You'll have your initial post, which will be your response to my prompt, your organization, purpose, and functions. And then you'll also then be responding to at least two of your colleagues. Your initial post, as we discussed on Saturday, can be concise and parsimonious. So we're looking at a paragraph or two is going to be sufficient for that. And then for each of your responses to a classmate, a paragraph is certainly fine for each one of those. I do ask if you can to try and post your initial post as early in the week as possible, because if everyone waits until next Monday to post their initial post, then we're all going to be scrambling to respond to classmates. So if you get your initial post done sometime this week, then you'll have until Monday night to respond to two of your classmates. So that's our Canvas essay number one that's coming due then on Monday. All righty. Are there any basic questions before we get into our information for tonight on the course? Any of this information that we covered on Saturday? Any clarifications or questions at all? Okay. As you revisit the syllabus and as we go through some of these assignments, if you do have any questions, as always, just shoot me an email and I'm happy to respond to any questions you may have. Okay. All right. Okay. Seeing no questions, let's go ahead and get into our information for tonight. And again, the purpose tonight is just kind of set the stage for what we are going to be doing in studying organizations and to provide us with a rationale, a justification for why we study organizations differently in the public as compared to the private sectors. And then I'm also going to spend a good bit of time in the first half of class here tonight introducing you to the Tompkins approach to analyzing these different schools of thought and these different theories in the organization theory literature. And I'll take you through the 4 different models of organizational effectiveness. I'll take you through the different mechanisms for coordination and control. And then I'll also take you through the motivational strategies that Tompkins talks about. And those 3 issues, if you will, those 3 topics really serve as a nice guide for how we are going to cover the theories and the schools of thought over the next 6 weeks. So we'll make sure everyone has a really good understanding of that before we then take a break for tonight. So that's what we'll be doing. So let me start our slides up. I think we all have a really good idea what organization theory is. We spent time in 500 talking about organization theory, and I walked you through from a very 30,000-foot helicopter level the evolution and development of the organization theory literature, especially the literature on studying public organizations. But because of the nature of PPA 500, we can only kind of hit the very highlights of each one of those theories and each of those schools of thought. So in this class, we're going to delve a lot deeper into each one of those theories. But we have a general sense in 500 that organization theory is obviously the study of organizations. And the purpose is to develop theories of relationships in these organizations so that we can take those theories and we can then use those theories to help us explain what happens in organizations, why organizations behave the way in which they do, the success and failure of organizations. And so we're going to develop these theories to help us then apply to a larger population, if you will, to then try and understand why our public organizations operate the way in which they operate. So as we develop these theories, we're going to focus on different aspects of organizations. Organization theory is very much the study of organization structure. And so, as you're familiar with from 500, there are some authors, such as Weber, who will look at the structure of the organization, the hierarchical chain of command, the way in which positions are arrayed within an organization, and we'll use the structure to help us explain why the organization behaves the way in which it behaves and why the organization does what it does. So we'll study organization structures. We'll study the specific behaviors of organizations, and we'll look at how the internal processes occur within organizations, and we'll also look at how those organizations then also relate to their external environments, understanding that we're going to study those external pressures and looking at the pressures that are being placed upon an organization by the external environment. And then sometimes more importantly, how do those organizations then respond to those challenges and those pressures being placed upon them by their external environment. And we'll also study the relationship between organizations and their members, the workers, the employees within those organizations. So we're studying structures, we're studying behaviors, we are studying relationships between organizations and their members, as well as relationships between the organizations and their external environment. And those are all aspects of public organization theory. The focus that we take in terms of studying organizations, we can take a macro level focus where we are looking at the institution itself. We're looking at the organization itself. How is it organized? What does the organization mean for the creation of outputs and outcomes from that organization? We're really taking an organizational level type of focus. Now, as we go through this class, we will reiterate this difference between outputs and outcomes. So if you don't remember that difference from 500, we essentially identified outputs as kind of the products and the goods and the services that are being created by an organization. Those are its outputs. The outcomes are then the consequences of those products, those goods, and those services. So the outcomes are much longer term in nature. And there are some authors we'll look at, such as Robert Merton, who talks about organizational effectiveness in terms of those outcomes Are those outcomes that are being produced by the outputs from the organization, are those outcomes meeting the wants, needs, and desires of the citizens who are consuming those outputs? And so the real focus with somebody like Merton is going to be on the effectiveness of the organization is really indexed to the consequences of that organization's behavior. But at the macro level, we are looking at the organization as an institution. Then we can take a micro level approach, and some of our theories will take a micro level approach where we will focus on elements within the organization. So the people who work in the organization, the units and divisions and departments within the organization, groups in the organization, whether they be formal groups that are sanctioned by the organization or some of these informal groups that are generated and just kind of organically form outside of the rules and regulations of the organization. So we're looking at the micro level at all these aspects within the organization. This is oftentimes going to be the focus of a lot of what we call our neoclassical theories. So the theories that came about as a result of some of the flaws in the classical theories, those neoclassical theories typically drill down to the specific elements in the micro level approach within the organization. And then there's the management approach. And the management approach, we are going to look at the processes and the practices of the organization. So we're going to look at how the organization interfaces with its employees, how the employees interface with the organization, the processes that are used on a daily basis to produce those goods, services, and products. Those are all the management-oriented types of approaches that we use in that management approach. So there are different ways that we can view organization theory depending upon which school of thought we are in, which theories we are dealing with. I oftentimes like to kind of liken this micro versus macro type of approach to the development of the literature in the field of political science. So if you were an undergraduate political science major, or if you took political science courses at the undergraduate level, you probably were told about the development of political science literature, in that in the 1950s, there was very much of a traditionalist approach to studying political science. And that traditionalist approach was really very much of an institutional approach. So in the 1950s, we studied Congress as an institution. We studied the office of the presidency as an institution. We studied the Supreme Court as an institution. So that's kind of your macro level institutional approach. Then in the 1960s and 70s, we started to develop more of what was called a behavioralist approach. And the behavioralist approach, we started focusing on individuals within those organizations. So instead of studying Congress as an institution, we studied individual members of Congress. And so a lot of authors started writing books and articles about the motivations of members of Congress when they vote. And so we ended up getting things like John Kingdon's model of decision making by members of Congress. We looked at why chairs of committees act differently than just rank and file members of those committees. But we looked at individual members of Congress, or we studied individual presidents rather than the office of the presidency. And that's kind of that more micro level type of an approach, a behavioralist approach in political science. Then in the 1980s and modern political science, it's taken on much more what's called a post-behavioralist approach, where instead of looking at the institution or just individual members, we look at the relationships between the organization and its members. And we look at that kind of two-way street between individual members of the organization and the organization itself, and what political scientists call a post-behavioralist type of model. So I think that's kind of similar to the way in which we have developed in our understanding of organization theory as well. A macro approach to a micro approach to more of a management orientation to how we study public organizations. So I told you on Saturday, one of the reasons why I like Tompkins' approach and why we use this textbook and why we got him to reprint this textbook is because I think it's a really good plan to study these theories and schools of thought kind of in a chronological order. And he takes his approach in his textbook very much in a chronological order, much like we are going to do in this course. There are a couple of variations from chronology, but for the most part, it's in chronological order. That is important because it allows us to see the evolution of the literature. And I think, as we had talked about in 500, each new school of thought and organization theory was created as a rejoinder or a response to some of the flaws identified in previous schools. So the human relations school was generated out of a criticism of the classical school. The human resource management school came about because of criticisms with the human relations school. The system school came about because of criticisms with all the preceding schools, so that they didn't look at the external environment, and so on and so on. So by looking at chronologically, you can kind of see how each new school of thought was a response or a rejoinder to the preceding school of thought. So what we will do is we will follow the development of organization literature, starting with classic bureaucratic theory from people like Max Weber. We'll talk about scientific management and the principles approach with people like Frederick Taylor and Luther Gulig. Administrative management with people like Henri Fayolle. Human relations and human resource management schools with people like Mary Parker Follett, Douglas McGregor, Abraham Maslow, Chris Argyris, Herzberg, and others. We'll look at the systems theory with people like Katz-Kahn and Chester Barnard. We'll look at theories such as structural functional theories with people like Robert Merton, people like Philip Selznick. We'll look at schools such as quality management with people like Deming. And we'll look at more modern theories such as organization culture from people like Sheen and Weechee, as well as leadership theories from people like Peters and others. So those are just some of the schools of thought that we're going to be looking at as we make our way through the next 6 weeks. But again, we're going to look at it kind of in this trajectory of moving from the classical world into some of these more modern neoclassical types of theories. But we are doing this in an MPA program. And so this is PPA 660 organization theory. We are not the only organization theory class on campus. Organization theory is obviously also taught in the College of Business. It's taught in healthcare administration. It's taught in recreation and leisure studies. It's taught to a degree in criminal justice. It's really taught across the entire campus. So the question becomes, what's the justification for having a course on public organizations and having this specific course of PPA 660? The basic justification is that studying public organizations will be different than non-public organizations because of the fundamental differences between the two sectors. In PPA 500, we spent some time talking about these differences between public and private sectors. You read the Graham Allison article about how public and private sectors are similar in all unimportant respects. And the basic argument that Allison makes in his article is that the functions of public and private management are very much similar. The difference is in how those functions are being done. And so I think there's a good justification for why we have to study public organizations differently than we would normally study a private organization. And so on the screen, I've just listed some of those differences that I think we all know very well at this point in the program. You've been in the program now for a year and a half. And so I think you've been introduced to these differences on several different occasions, so you're familiar with them. But one of the major differences is a difference in terms of power and authority. Public organizations are created through enabling legislation. So they are created from legislative bodies. This legislation, this enabling legislation, has the power of law behind it, has the power of government behind it. So there is this authority that public organizations have that private organizations may not. And one of those authorities that public organizations can have in implementing policies and programs is a coercive authority, that governments can coerce their citizens to take certain types of actions they otherwise would not do. And in 500, we define this idea of power as the ability to utilize resources to influence someone to do something they otherwise would not do. So when you have that type of power, you have that type of authority, that's something is much more part and parcel of a public organization than it may be a private organization. Well, so what? And you know, from having me before, you know that my favorite answer is it depends. And my favorite question is, so what? So the question here is, well, so what? What difference does it make that public organizations have this power and authority basis that their private sector counterparts may lack? And the so what from the study of organization theory is that the scope of what is done in public organizations tends to be much larger and much more profound sometimes than what you might get from a singular private corporation. Some authors will make the argument that the roles of public administrators are much more what's called expository than the roles of private sector managers. And by expository, they basically mean that we do a lot of role modeling in the public sector. And, you know, society takes some cues from how things are done in public organizations. And so it kind of raises the stakes a bit when you are talking about a public as compared to a private organization. We also know that the environment is much different between the public and private sectors. In the public sector, we have a much more dynamic, a much more heterogeneous, and a much more political environment than what you might normally see over in the private sector. Well, the so what of that is when we are dealing in a more political environment, it means that the roles of administrators and organizations are much more a role of bargaining and negotiation. There's a lot more bargaining, a lot more negotiation that goes on in the public sector than what you might have over in the private sector. Also, when you have a much more heterogeneous external environment in the public sector, you have a lot of different types of demands that you have to respond to. You have a lot of different challenges that are placed upon your organization as compared to if you were in the private sector. You also think about when you are delivering these programs and delivering these policies in the public sector, you oftentimes need to do it in combination with other organizations. So, in combination with private sector organizations, nonprofit organizations, in combination with other public sector organizations. So, we have a lot more need for these governing networks. And so, again, a lot more influences from outside than what you might have in the private sector. The softer goals and objectives in the public sector that you're all very familiar with, and that instead of just measuring the amount of a product we're creating and then the profit margin we get from selling that product, we're trying to accomplish other goals such as enhancing the quality of life of citizens. Quality of life is a very soft goal. It's something that's much more subjective, something that's much more qualitative in measurement. So it becomes more difficult for us to measure those soft goals and objectives. And we also have a lot more limitations upon our actions in the public sector. We have limitations that come to us from the legal world, procedural limitations, political limitations. All these limitations mean that there are constraints that are placed upon these public managers in terms of managing their organizations. We have to understand that and we have to appreciate that when we study those organizations. So, in terms of legal types of limitations, again, we know that the genesis of our organization and the genesis of the programs and policies that we are implementing, that genesis comes from enabling legislation. And so we're basically told what we're doing, who we are, and how we're doing it by a legislative body. So we have these legal types of requirements. As public administrators, we have this thing that's referred to as qualified good faith immunity. And I believe we talked about this in 500 as well. In qualified good faith immunity, we are expected to know and endeavor not to violate the constitutional rights of people that we are dealing with. And so we kind of have this heightened expectation that in order to remain immune from civil and criminal liability, we need to endeavor not to violate the constitutional rights of people that we deal with. Hence the reason why we spend an entire week or so going through the Constitution in your first course so that you are aware of what the Constitution says because of this idea of qualified good faith immunity. So, in terms of the standards tend to be higher in the public sector in terms of how we are dealing with citizens and dealing with consumers. We have a lot of procedural types of requirements in the public sector. Our employees are career civil servants as opposed to being at will employees. We have to follow those career civil service requirements, but in addition to that, we then also have to follow collective bargaining agreement requirements because our employees are unionized at a much higher level than they are in the private sector. So we're developing theories to understand why organizations do what they do. We also have to remember all these procedural limitations placed upon us in terms of managing our employees. We have procedural requirements placed upon us in terms of how we spend money. And so you had the budgeting course. And so in the budgeting course, you talked about things such as modified accrual accounting as opposed to cash-based accounting, the idea of audit requirements. And so we do have to be very careful how this money is being spent. You talked about fund-based accounting. And so you know that there are these different funds that we use in governmental accounting. We have general funds and special revenue funds, and then we have proprietary, and then we have fiduciary funds. And so depending on what fund money is in, there are going to be different limitations on how those monies can be spent. We cannot take money from a proprietary, from an enterprise fund, and use it to backfill our general fund. Eventually, we're going to have to repay that money because state law tells us we have to repay that money, typically within about 6 months. So those are procedural requirements upon our resources and how we manage those fiscal resources. If any of you do any work in procurement or contracting, you're very familiar with the procedural requirements that come to us from public contract code here in California state law. You know about competitive bidding and when you need to do competitive bidding as opposed to negotiated bidding. You're also probably familiar with the bid process and responsible versus responsive bids and awarding the bid to the lowest responsive and responsible bidder. Know about bid protests. So all these are all procedural requirements that we need to adhere to. Even how we borrow money, as you probably learned about in budgeting as well, is different. In the public sector, public organizations have procedures they have to follow. Local governments, whenever they go out there to issue debt and to issue a bond, there are a lot of procedures they have to follow in the issuance of that bond. There are procedures they have to follow in terms of selecting underwriters. There's a set fee that has to be paid to underwriters for bonds in the public sector that you don't have over in the private sector. And obviously a lot of these political limitations. So as we talked about in 500, in the public sector, we serve many masters. We have separation of powers, and so we serve the legislature, the executive, and the judiciary. But then we also have federalism, this vertical separation of powers, where we then have to serve national, state, and local governments as well. So the vertical as well as the horizontal limitations on power, those are political influences, and that we're serving all these many masters. Norton Long is one of those public administration theorists who talks a lot about the political role of public managers and how public managers have now taken on a much more political role than they ever have in the past. Hence the reason why Woodrow Wilson's politics administration dichotomy is not nearly as true today as it may have been back in 1887. So we've got all these differences between public and private organizations, which means that our theories have to encompass and have to embrace those differences between those different types of organizations. Since public and private organizations are fundamentally different, at least in terms of how they do their business and how they carry out their functions, it means that the models and the theories that we get in the private sector oftentimes cannot then just be directly applied to public organizations. If we could take private organization theories and apply them directly to our public organizations, there would be no reason for us to develop public organization theory. There'd be no reason for us to have an organization theory course. So these private sector models and theories don't work that well in the public sector because, again, of these different goals and objectives. A lot of the theories in the private sector are focused upon efficiency. They're focused on trying to do more with less in order to enhance profit margins. Those theories that are predicated upon enhancing profit margins obviously are not going to be that applicable in the public sector unless you're talking about something like a government corporation. So our different goals and objectives will mean we need to develop different public specific theories. The principal agent relationship, as it works here in the public sector, is different than how it might work in the private sector. And in 500, we introduced the idea of the principal agent relationship. You may have encountered it in other courses in the program. Can somebody tell me what the principal agent relationship is? What is the principal agent relationship? Anybody remember that? The principal agent relationship? I think in 500, we talk about that within the context of accountability and ethics and to whom we are being held accountable for in the public sector. And the principal agent relationship is it's an interesting theory that essentially says that, again, going back to this many masters theory, that in public organizations are essentially the agents in this relationship. And oftentimes the legislative bodies, the enablers, are then the principals. So the legislative bodies oversee the actions taken by the agent, by the organization. Typically, in your basic principal agent relationship, you would think that the information resides with the principal. The principal can then use that information in order to oversee the actions taken by the agent. However, in the public sector, in this principal agent relationship, the information really resides at the agency, at the organizational level. Who knows better how a program is being implemented than that organization itself and those people in the organization who are implementing those programs on a daily basis. So whenever the information resides at the agency level, the problem for the principal agent relationship is obviously the principal doesn't have access to that information unless the agency wants to provide that information to the principal. This is what we said introduces this idea of what we call a moral hazard. And in that moral hazard, you have an ethical dilemma for administrators in that they need to decide what information and how much information to provide to the principal to allow the principal to then oversee the actions of the agency. There's a natural incentive to not provide information because the more information you provide, the more information the principal then has to do aggressive oversight over the agency. And so there's a natural incentive not to provide that information. That's the moral hazard. But we do need to provide that information for a couple of reasons. One reason is it allows that principal agent relationship to work. As administrators, we do not have that direct connective tissue to the voters. We are not voted into our offices. We get our positions based upon our expertise, our knowledge, skills, and our abilities, our KSAs. The people who are directly elected by voters are the elected officials in these legislative bodies. So the way in which the public holds us accountable as administrators is through the conduit of elected officials. So we need to provide that information to the elected officials, the principals, to allow them to do the job. That's a relationship you oftentimes don't see in the private sector. You don't have this need to have a conduit to hold people accountable to the public. It just doesn't exist in the same way in which it does in the public sector. But the more information you give to the principal, the more information the principal then has to hold you accountable and to oversee your actions, and the less flexibility and latitude you probably have on a daily basis. So it's kind of this push and pull in terms of, there's information you should give, but there's an incentive for you to not give that information. The difficulty in quantifying outputs and outcomes, as we had talked about before, are much softer. Goals and objectives are much softer. Outputs and outcomes are much more difficult for us to measure and quantify than it would be sometimes in the private sector. Widget making factory is making widgets. Those widgets are very easy to quantify. You know how many you're making, you know your costs it requires to make them, you know what you're selling them for, you know your profit margin, very quantifiable type of information. Much more difficult for us to quantify it in the public sector. Granted, we can look at how many people are participating in this public program. Granted, we can look at how frequently they participate in this public program, but some of the benefits they get from participation in that public program are much more difficult to quantify. They're much more qualitative types of measurements. And when you have difficulty quantifying your outputs and outcomes, sometimes it's difficult for you to understand what your true goals are. And if you have difficulty coming up with what your goals are and identifying and defining your goals, that in turn is probably going to make it difficult for you to measure performance because you don't really know what is considered to be high performance on the part of your employees if you have not articulated measurable indicators of what those employees are supposed to try and achieve. And then if you have trouble measuring the performance of your employees, then you're also going to have trouble compensating those employees and deciding what types of rewards should be given out to which employees based upon performance levels. So it's much, for lack of a better term, muddier in the public sector. And so a lot of those business models that are much more clear cut and profit motivated based upon the idea of at will as opposed to career civil servants, at will employees, then it's much more difficult to translate those into the public sector. However, that being said, as you probably know, some of the theories that we will cover in this class come to us directly from the private sector. But we have to take those theories and we have to modify them to make them fit the unique characteristics of a public organization. But to make it a little bit more, a little muddier and a little bit more complex is that even when we're dealing with only public organizations, so we're not mixing apples and oranges, we're not looking at public versus private, even when we're only dealing with public organizations, we also have to recognize that those public organizations differ greatly from each other. That just because you're a public organization doesn't mean you're going to look like another public organization. We know public organizations differ across a variety of elements that will have important implications for us in how we study those organizations. So we know that organizations differ in terms of size. We have some, just think about the federal level, we have some very, very small commissions. One example is the Marine Mammal Commission. It's a commission made up of 12 marine biologists, and they have a very small staff, but you literally have less than about 20 people working in this federal commission. Very, very small commission. Contrast that to something like the Department of Health and Human Services, which has tens of thousands of employees. The Department of Defense, that has millions of employees. So a lot of differences in terms of size of the organization. That's going to have important implications, for example, for a theory like democratic governance from Mary Parker Follett. Mary Parker Follett says that we need to engage our employees in participation throughout the decision-making process. Well, that's a lot easier to do when you have 12 marine biologists working together as opposed to when you have hundreds of thousands of employees. So the size of the organization will have a different impact upon which theories work versus which theories do not work quite as well. Organizations in the public sector have different structures. Some of our organizations have very tall hierarchies. Some of our organizations have very flat hierarchies, and they're much more collegial in nature. I know it's from the political world, but you think about Congress and think about the way the House works versus the way the Senate works. The House is a very regimented organization. It has a very regimented type of structure. The Senate is a much more collegial, egalitarian body without the structure that the House of Representatives has. And so when people study Congress, they oftentimes have to develop different theories for the House as opposed to the theories they develop for the Senate. Different organizations have different functions. Some organizations are engaged in direct administration. Some organizations are engaged in indirect administration. Those that are engaged in direct administration, they are interfacing directly with citizens. So they are the ones who are delivering those goods and services, those programs directly to citizens on a daily basis. Those are what Michael Lipsky would refer to as our street level bureaucrats. They are at the street level. They are doing those line types of functions. Some of our other organizations have much more of an indirect administrative orientation in that they are not interfacing directly with citizens, but rather they are providing the resources to then make that direct interface possible by other organizations. So a great example of that at the federal level is the GSA, the General Services Administration. The General Services Administration is responsible for managing things such as the leases of other agencies. A lot of federal agencies don't have their own buildings. They lease space in privately owned office buildings. Well, the GSA will be managing those leases. So they're not dealing with implementing programs on a daily basis. They're dealing with providing the support that the agencies need that are doing those things on a daily basis. GSA helps to organize a lot of the bulk purchases of supplies for federal agencies. Again, that's a support, an indirect type of administration. So whether you're doing direct or indirect administration will have an impact upon how you study those organizations. Those organizations that are doing direct administration, who are interfacing daily with citizens, they're going to be much more connected to their external environment than an agency that's doing indirect administration. The more connected they are to their external environment, the more we have to incorporate that into our theories. The more we have to look at something more like what we would call an open systems or a systems resource type of a model, where we are looking at that two-way street of the relationship between the organization and stakeholders in its external environment. Speaking of environments, there are different environments that organizations operate within. We always have to look at the environment to see how well the environment can support the operations of the organization. So what we look at with the environment is we are looking at the capacity of that environment to support the organization. Some organizations operate in environments that have a strong capacity to help support the organizations, some do not. So if you think about if you have an organization that's involved in some very technical types of things on a daily basis that require employees who have technical expertise, but it's an agency that's located perhaps in a very rural area, that's located very far away from research institutions and research universities, that environment may not provide you with the requisite labor pool that you need in order to support the agency. And so that would be an agency that's working in an environment that doesn't have the capacity to support it. You think about resources in terms of environmental capacity. So money is the lifeblood of an organization. So if you're an organization that's working you're located in a state that has a massive budget deficit, sound familiar? Has a massive budget deficit, you may not be able to get the appropriations that you need in order to maintain your operations. So your environment is not capable of sustaining you in terms of your monetary types of resources. If you are delivering a program that ideologically is very far afield from the prevailing ideological orientation of elected officials in your state, that could also be an example of an environment that is not supportive of the organization. In that manner, it may not be that the resources are not there. It's more of a manner that the elected officials, for ideological purposes, do not want to provide those resources to the agency. So that's why when we develop our organization theories, especially modern organization theories, we have to take into account the context, the environment in which those organizations are operating. So one size fits all panacea is simply not going to work. Different types of employees in different types of organizations. Some organizations have some employees who, or a large amount of their employees who are in very technical fields. Others are in more human services types of fields. And so you think about the employees that work for the Department of Public Social Services, DPSS. Compare that to the employees who might work at MTA or OCTA. MTA and OCTA tend to be populated with a lot of engineers. And so they come at questions, they come at issues from much more of an engineering type of background, where in DPSS, you have people who are coming at questions and issues from much more of a human services, social services type of background. So different employees will also have an impact upon the usefulness of different types of theories. So again, a panacea is not going to work. We're going to have to really look at who is working in these organizations and the orientation and the wants, needs, and desires of those employees who are working in those organizations. To look at employees a little bit differently, you can also look at it from a generational perspective. And there's a very interesting, I'll find a link for it and put it up on our Canvas site. But every year, the Merit System Protection Board puts together a study of federal employee engagement, where they basically ask the question, how engaged and how motivated are public administrators in federal agencies and federal departments? And it's a really interesting study, but one of the demographic things that they do in the study is they look at the composition of the federal workforce in terms of generations. And so they've been doing this every single year for the past, I don't know, 20 or 30 years. And it's really interesting as you look at how the composition of the federal workforce has changed from a generational perspective. Now in the federal workforce, traditionalist generation, which is basically what we used to call, the greatest generation, the traditionalist generation makes up less than 1% of the federal workforce, which is not terribly surprising because most of those people have already retired and moved on. The one generation that still makes up a plurality of federal employees is Generation X. So we have not a majority anymore. It used to be a majority a few years ago. Now it's a plurality. It's about something like 43 or 44% of the federal workforce are Gen Xers. Generation Y, that is growing greatly in terms of their composition, and we're starting to see more and more of those folks coming into the workforce. And so you're really seeing this generational shift. That generational shift has a big impact upon the theories that we develop for our organizations. An example of that is someone like Anthony Downs and his Bureau ideologies. And Anthony Downs makes the argument that you manage younger employees that are much more motivated by advancement opportunities differently than you might want to manage what he calls the conservers, people who have been in the organization for a while, and they're not really motivated by moving up the organization ladder. They're more motivated by keeping all the perks of the office that they have developed and accumulated over the years. So the younger employees he calls the climbers, the more veteran employees he calls the conservers. So if you have an organization that's full of climbers, then to make that organization effective and to motivate your employees, you're going to have a lot of professional development. You have to have a lot of opportunities for advancement. If you have an organization that's full of conservers, then you're probably not going to need that amount of professional development or those opportunities for advancement. So the type of employee, where that employee is in terms of their personal growth, their maturation process, that's going to have a big impact upon how the types of theories that you develop in terms of how to manage those organizations. And different organizations use different technologies as well. And here's a lot of alliteration. So you're going to, I like this because I like alliteration, but it's called Thompson's Typology of Technology. So I know a lot of T's there, but Thompson's Typology of Technology. Thompson makes the argument that in organizations, there tends to be three different types of technologies that are used. The most basic type of technology is what is referred to as a log-linked technology. And log-linked is kind of like, you envision, if you've got all these logs flowing down a river and they're all linked together. And so first comes this log, then this log, then this log. You take them out, we'll take out one of those logs, and then the whole process falls apart. A log link type of technology is kind of similar to what you normally would see in a factory, like an auto factory. And so as the car is going down the assembly line, one person has the job of putting on the headlights, the other person has a job of putting on the fender, another person has a job of putting on the bumper, but everyone's job is dependent upon the person before them on the assembly line doing their job. And that's what is referred to as a log link type of technology. And that, again, is typically what we see in the private sector in very much of a factory type of setting. A second type of technology, according to our good friend Thompson, is what he calls a mediating technology. In a mediating technology, employees basically connect citizens and consumers with resources. So they're kind of this mediating force between the consumer and the resources that consumer needs. So an example could be something like an employment bureau. So the purpose of that employment bureau is to help people find gainful employment. And so what they will do is they will meet with the person, they'll provide that person with job listings, they'll provide them with career development opportunities, work training types of work development type of opportunities. They are connecting them with these resources that will then help them get jobs. And so that's kind of this mediating type of technology. And this is something that we tend to do uh, somewhat frequently in the public sector. Then the third type of technology that we do a lot more in the public sector is what he calls intensive technology. According to Thompson, an intensive technology is when we are dealing with different people differently. So we recognize that the people we are dealing with have different types of wants, needs, and desires. And so, therefore, the way in which we deal with person A may be different than the way in which we deal with person B, which may be different than the way in which we deal with person C. So, the decisions we are making when we are serving our constituents or our customers or our clients or citizens, whatever word you want to use, is going to be different depending upon the person that we are dealing with. So it really becomes much more of an it depends type of approach, the way in which we are doing our jobs in what he calls an intensive technology. A lot of organizations, especially social service organizations, are engaged much more in an intensive technology than mediating or certainly log link types of technologies. So the approach to the technology that's being used by an organization will also have an impact upon the utility of the theory being applied to that organization. Again, all of this is just a justification for why we cannot use a panacea, why we cannot use a one size fits all approach to understand all of our public organizations, because our public organizations are so different in terms of size, structure, functions, environments, employees, and technologies. So because we cannot apply a panacea to every organization, it then suggests to us the need to develop specific discrete theories to apply in different situations to different organizations. In other words, it gives us another justification for why organization theory in the public sector is so important. This just really underscores the fact that in this class, we're not looking for the best answer for an organization, but rather we are looking for the most appropriate answer. So, what theory, what approach is most appropriate for this organization in this context at this point in time? There never is a one best approach that can be applied to every single organization. And that is really the thread that ties the entire development of organization theory together. This movement away from the search for the one size fits all approach, the search for the magic bullet. Modern organization theories recognize that there is no panacea, there is no magic bullet. So now that we've established this justification for why we study public organization theory, the next question we have to answer is how are we going to do it? How are we going to study these organization theories? And again, the Tompkins textbook is my personal favorite because of the way in which he is able to show you the connective tissue, to show you the relationships between all the different schools of thought and the different theories. So as we talk about a school of thought or as we talk about a theory, whenever we're done discussing that theory or that school of thought, we will then go to these three ways in which we can analyze these theories and compare them to each other. What model of effectiveness is represented by this theory? What mechanisms of control and coordination are represented by this theory? And then what motivational strategies are represented by this theory? So I'd like to take a little bit of time going through this methodology that we're going to be using, because we're going to use this methodology throughout the entire course as we compare one theory or school of thought to another theory or another school of thought. So if you have the Tompkins textbook handy, if you don't, it's okay. But if you have it handy, if you can take a look at page 28, because on page 28, this is where Tompkins begins his discussion of what he calls these four models of organizational effectiveness. And to be fair, these four different models of organizational effectiveness that we're going to be using, they don't necessarily come from Tompkins. What we're doing is we are kind of modifying an approach that comes from authors by the name of Quinn and Rohrbach. So this is known as the Quinn and Rohrbach Competing Values Framework that establishes for us four different models of organizational effectiveness, four different ways in which we can determine if an organization is being effective. Now, effectiveness is important for us in this discussion because obviously if we are developing a theory of how an organization should operate, that is what we call a normative approach. We're saying this is how the organization should, this is how the organization ought to structure itself or to treat its employees or to interact with its environment. And we're saying it should do this for the purpose of making the organization effective. The primary reason why we have 150 years of the development of organization theories is this search for organizational effectiveness. How can we make our organizations more effective? I think we all kind of have a general sense when we talk about effectiveness of what we mean by effectiveness. But my question to you is, what makes an organization effective? How would you define effectiveness for an organization? An effective organization is one that does what? Yeah, Amanda, go ahead.
Maybe something like efficiently using their resources to meet their stated goals. So, like I work in a rec department, some divisions are, focused on providing certain services to the community and they're grant funded. So they have a very specific budget. So they have to kind of meet those goals without obviously going over budget because they're grant funded. So there's nowhere else to get the money from.
Right. Yeah, exactly. I think the primary way in which you usually define effectiveness is just what you said, man, is how well can we achieve our goals? How well are we using our resources in order to achieve our stated goals? That approach is what's known as a goal attainment or a goal type of model. And so that's one of the first models that he talks about here in Exhibit 3.1 on page 28. So in this competing values framework, the whole purpose of this framework is, again, to kind of show us different ways in which we can measure organizational effectiveness. So that first approach that Amanda mentioned is what's referred to as the goal attainment or the rational goal model. And that one is represented in the bottom right cell of this matrix that's provided for you on page 28. Now, the way in which the Quinn-Rohrbach matrix works is that there are two axes. There's a y-axis and there is an x-axis. So a horizontal axis, which is your x-axis, and a vertical axis, which is your y-axis. As you'll see on the x-axis, your horizontal axis, the models that are to the left are focused internally to the organization. So they're looking inside the organization. So they're looking at individuals working in the organization. They're looking at processes that are going on a daily basis in the organization, but they are going to look inside the organization to measure and define effectiveness. And those are the ones on the left side. On the right side is more of an external focus. So the models on the right side of the matrix, they are looking more external, outside the walls of the organization. So left is internal, right is external. Then for the y-axis, the vertical axis, at the top of the chart, those are the theories that favor flexibility. The ones at the bottom are the ones that favor control. So more flexible ones at the top, more oriented around control at the bottom. But the whole goal here is to create a quality output, which is the indicator of the effectiveness for the organization. So the one that we had talked about, Amanda had mentioned, is this goal model, rational goal or goal attainment model. It's at the bottom right of this matrix. Since it's on the bottom right, it's on the right-hand side, which means it kind of has a more external focus. It's on the bottom, which means it's more control-oriented. In this rational type of goal model, this goal attainment model, we engage in goal setting, we engage in strategic planning for the purpose of trying to make our organization more efficient and more productive. And if we achieve efficiency and productivity, then hopefully we will attain those goals that we have developed as an organization. So we're going to measure our effectiveness based upon how well we are achieving our stated goals as an organization. Now, you might ask, well, why is that more of an external focus? I think in the public sector, it tends to be more of an external focus because a lot of the goals that we establish as an organization, they're at the minimum guided by the enabling legislation that created the organization or created the programs and policies that we are implementing. So oftentimes the goals that we're trying to achieve as a public organization are goals that are kind of provided to us in that legislation. So oftentimes those goals are at least partially motivated by external forces. So the theories that we talk about in this class that are more rational goal attainment, and orientation, those are going to fall in this bottom right-hand cell. So that's our rational goal type of an approach. Above that, in the top right-hand cell, you have what's called the open systems model. Sometimes it's referred to as systems resource model. In this open systems type of model, organizations must be adaptive to their environment. They must be very flexible to adapt to changes in the environment. And the way in which you measure their effectiveness is in how well they have grown as an organization through acquiring resources from the environment. So theories that look at or define effectiveness as the acquiring resources from the environment, those are the ones that are going to fall in this open systems model, sometimes called systems resource. So the measure of effectiveness is not necessarily are we achieving our goal that we stated, but rather how well are we obtaining resources from our external environment. So systems theory is an example, Katz-Kahn systems theory. That's an example of what would be considered to be an open systems type of model of effectiveness. So there are a lot of resources you can acquire, as we had mentioned before. You can acquire money through appropriations, or as Amanda had mentioned, through grants. You know, those resources, the more you can get, the more effective you are as an organization in this type of an approach. Highly skilled labor pool, getting employees into the organization that have the requisite skills to do the job. That would be acquiring resources from the external environment. Political support, getting support from elected officials, getting support from our constituent groups, our client groups, that type of support from the external environment. That's also a resource that can be imported by organizations. And so those theories that define effectiveness as we are trying to grow as an organization through resource acquisition, those are going to then fall in this top right-hand cell. Obviously, it's on the right-hand side because it's external. We're looking at the external environment, and it falls at the top because we have to emphasize flexibility so that we can be flexible to adapt to changes in our environment so we can better acquire those precious resources. Then shift over to the top left-hand cell, you have what's called the human relations model. In the human relations model, we are now trying to enhance cohesion and morale among our employees for the purpose of helping those employees develop as human resources. So the goal here is to create a very competent, integrated, and dedicated workforce to help people develop into these human resources. Obviously, it's internal because we're looking at people working within the organization, and it's also flexible because there are multiple paths that someone can pursue in order to, as Maslow would call it, self-actualize, or to develop in the way they want to develop as a human resource. So that would be what we consider to be the human relations model. A lot of our neoclassical theories like human relations, human resource management theories, those are going to fall into that human relations model. The organization is effective if it's able to develop people as human resources and create this very cohesive, very high morale, very motivated type of workforce. And those are going to be the indicators of an organization's effectiveness. Then the bottom left, we have what's called the internal process model. That internal process model is obviously on the left-hand side because it's an internal focus, and it's at the bottom because the focus is very much on control. What we try and do is we try and control communications, we try and control information management for the purpose of developing stable processes within the organization. So in order to establish those stable processes, we need to control and coordinate the work activities that are going on a daily basis within the organization. So in this internal process model, we are quite literally looking at the daily processes by which work is being done inside the organization. So an effective organization in the internal process model would be defined as an organization that has this cohesive, motivated workforce that has well-established processes and protocols that result in organizational harmony. So you've got this cohesion, this kind of teamwork type of team spirit. Those indicators of organizational harmony would be indicators of organizational effectiveness in this internal process model. Again, so what? Why these four models? Because these four models will help us compare and distinguish between the different theories that we talk about over the next 6 weeks. Rather than just throwing a bunch of theories at you and just talking about what those theories are, now when we are done talking about each one of those theories, we will return to this chart. And you'll see what Tompkins does, and I hope it's a good job of doing it in this new reprinted version. In the older version, sometimes the shading was a little bit light, but what he will do is he will shade these cells in depending upon where the theory fits in these four different models. It's important to note that these four models are not mutually exclusive. You can have a theory that emphasizes 1, 2, 3, or sometimes all four of these different models of organizational effectiveness. So, for example, one of the theories we'll talk about, the structural contingency model. The structural contingency model emphasizes all four of these models in this matrix. There'll be some other theories that we talk about that nothing will be shaded in because they really do not emphasize any of those four different models in the matrix. But this is just one way that we are going to compare our theories. Which of these four models of organizational effectiveness is emphasized by the theory, so that we can then do a little bit of contrasting, a little bit of comparison between our different theories. So that's one way we're going to do it. Another way we're going to do it is by using this theory from Mintzberg of the methods and mechanisms for coordination and control of work. So what do these models say about the way in which managers and leaders control and coordinate the work that's going on within organizations? And so here we have 6 different possible mechanisms that a theory can emphasize: mutual adjustment, direct supervision, standardization of work processes, standardization of work outputs, standardization of worker skills, and standardization of values. Mutual adjustment. This is the mechanism that we see highlighted most oftentimes in things like human relations and human resource management theory. This is where workers consult with each other informally about what needs to be accomplished and how. Responsibility for the coordination and control of work rests with those who are doing the work. So this is very much controlling work by allowing people self-governance and self-determination. Those who are doing the work are then delegated control over how that work gets done. That's what's known as the mutual adjustment way of controlling work. So work is essentially being controlled by those individuals who are doing that work on a daily basis. Then the second option, which is kind of diametrically opposed to the first one, is direct supervision. A supervisor is assigned to take responsibility for a group of workers, and a managerial hierarchy is established to integrate the efforts of all work groups. The supervisor issues personal instructions and monitors individual performance. So this is your very top-down, direct top-down control over the work being done on a daily basis. So that's direct supervision. Another mechanism for control and coordination is the standardization of work processes. So something that's kind of similar to what we learned about with scientific management and Frederick Taylor. Work is programmed in advance of its execution by developing rules and standard operating procedures, specifying how everyone is to perform assigned tasks. Coordination is built into the work process itself, and control is achieved by strictly limiting each worker's discretion. So here's the one best way to do the job. We're then going to monitor employees to make sure that they are doing that job in that one best way. Then there's a fourth approach known as standardization of work outputs. Work outputs are programmed in advance by providing each work group with product specifications or performance goals and allowing members considerable latitude in determining how to achieve them. Control is exercised by collecting output data, requiring corrective action when needed, and rewarding and sanctioning workers based on results achieved. One of the theories that we're going to talk about in this class is quality management. Quality management works very well with work outputs. We're standardizing the outputs, the products that are being created by the organization, and then we'll have specifications for the standards that we're going to hold those outputs to. That those outputs are not meeting those standards, those expectations, then obviously there will be penalties and changes to the work process to make sure that the output of what we are creating does actually meet the standards that we have established. Standardization of worker skills. Workers are employed who possess the knowledge and skills needed to make appropriate decisions. Educational institutions and professional associations are relied upon to provide standardized training. Professionally trained workers are largely self-coordinating and self-controlling. This is something you can kind of see in NASPA accreditation. I've already talked to you many, many times about how NASPA accreditation means that there are required competencies, and everyone has to demonstrate 5 universal required competencies when they graduate from an MPA program. Those competencies are somewhat an example of the standardization of these worker skills. So you've acquired the knowledge and the skills needed in order to make decisions appropriately in your organizations. And then finally, standardization of values. Organizational leaders communicate and act upon a clear vision of what the organization exists to do, where it should be headed, and what values should guide it. Coordination and control is facilitated by commitment of organizational members to shared internalized values and ideas. So here we have this congruence of values within our organization. Everyone has internalized the values of the organization, the ideals of the organization, the purpose of the organization. That's all standardized across our employees. By standardizing those values, that helps to control how the work is being done on a daily basis. So also when we finish each one of our theories, we're not just going to look at what model of organizational effectiveness they emphasize. We're also going to look at which of these mechanisms for coordination control are emphasized by those models as well. So this is our second way of comparing our theories to each other. So we'll do that at the end of our discussion of each one of our theories. And then the third way in which you're going to compare these theories is by comparing them according to the motivational strategies that they advocate and emphasize. So on page 37, you'll see that there are 4 motivational strategies here based largely on Katz and Kahn. And those 4 strategies are legal compliance, instrumental rewards, job identification, and goal agreement or goal congruence. And so in terms of legal compliance, in legal compliance, we motivate people using rules, formal directives, and sanctions to direct and control employee behavior. Employees may come to work, comply with rules, and satisfy minimum role requirements, either because they accept the legitimacy of organizational authority or they fear being sanctioned. So here are the things that we are holding people accountable for, like arriving to work on time, being punctual. And then if you're not punctual, then there are going to be some punitive measures. So You have to comply with these legal requirements, with these policies, with these rules and these regulations. If you do not comply with them, then there will be punitive measures. So we're motivating people basically by requiring them to comply with these rules and these laws and these regulations. So that's the legal compliance way in which you motivate employees. So that's kind of the stick approach. Then there's the carrot approach and instrumental rewards. And so we use these rewards in order to elicit desired behaviors on the part of our employees. So rewards for performance, distributing pay, promotions, recognition based upon individual performance. Employees may meet or exceed role expectations because they value the material and psychological satisfactions that money, advancement, and recognition can provide. So these are going to be tangible rewards that are provided for people if they perform well. Another type of instrumental reward is considerate leadership, adopting a leadership style based upon being attentive to employees and considerate of their needs. The strategy may improve morale. It may also induce those who value respect, support, and approval of persons in authority to meet or exceed their role requirements. So considerate leadership, leading in a way in which you're being attentive to your employees, you're paying attention to your employees, you're recognizing the needs of your employees, and that then motivates those employees to be more productive. Then the third type of instrumental reward is group acceptance, creating a work environment that allows employees to socialize, form group bonds, enjoy the approval of their peers. The strategy may induce those who value affiliation and peer approval to meet and exceed role requirements, assuming that group norms are consistent with organizational objectives. And so people are motivated by being allowed to work in groups. We know from Elton Mayo that work environments are social environments, and those work environments must align with the social wants, needs, and desires of individual employees. And so if you recognize these groups, you recognize the social aspect of the organization, that can then be a motivating factor for your employees as well. Then the third approach is job identification, offering work that is interesting, challenging, and responsible. Employees come to work, meet and exceed role requirements, and possibly exhibit greater creativity and innovativeness. They may do so because they identify with the jobs and find their work intrinsically rewarding. The more people identify with their job, the more motivated they will be to be productive and achieve higher levels of performance. We see this coming out of human resource management theorists like Douglas McGregor and Chris Ardress, talking about things like job enrichment and allowing people to participate in redesigning their jobs to make their jobs more intellectually stimulating and afford them the opportunity to develop the types of skills that they want to develop as a human resource. And then your fourth one is goal agreement or goal congruence, hiring employees whose goals and values are congruent with the organization's and or socializing employees so that they internalize organizational goals and values. Employees may come to work, remain with the organization, meet or exceed role requirements, and exhibit greater creativity, innovativeness, and institutional loyalty. They do so because they identify with the organization's mission and values, and because contributing to them reinforces their own self-concept. Goal congruence is one of the basic elements of motivating employees. The more that the goals of the individual are in agreement and are congruent with the goals of the organization, the more likely you are going to have a highly motivated and well-performing group of employees. So how well can we find that nexus between individual goals and organizational goals? The better we can find that nexus, the better we can then motivate our employees. So again, as we talk about these theories and these schools of thought, some of them will be based upon legal compliance. Some will be based upon instrumental rewards. Some will be based upon job identification. Some will be based upon goal congruence. Some of them will emphasize more than one of these motivational strategies. Some of them will not emphasize any of these motivational strategies, but it's just a third way in which we can compare the different theories and the different schools of thought together. So models of organizational effectiveness, mechanisms for coordination and control, and then motivational strategies that are emphasized by these different theories and these different schools of thought. Again, I think what that's going to do is give us this rhyme and reason to understanding all these different theories and all these different schools of thought so we can then compare them to each other. So every time we talk about a theory, we're going to return to these three different ways of comparing the theories. We're going to do it for each one of our theories, each one of our schools of thought. So it's just kind of important at this point to present that to you because, again, we're going to start doing that next week with the classical theories, and we'll follow that through each of our subsequent discussions. In terms of the material for tonight, that's what I have on agenda to cover tonight. Are there any questions about any of this introductory material? Again, I think you've got a pretty good sense of differences between public and private organizations, a pretty good sense of why we study public organizations differently than private sector organizations, a pretty good understanding of the differences and nuances between different public organizations. But any questions or any observations or clarifications? If not, then I would recommend we take a break. It's 7:20. So let's take about a 15-minute break. I've come back at 7:35. And when we come back at 7:35, I then have a breakout room assignment for us to do. I'll put you into different breakout rooms. Given the number of people we have here tonight, we'll probably do 4 breakout rooms of 5 people each. And I'll just assign randomly. And then what each group will do is identify 2 characteristics of your organizations that may make it difficult for you to apply private organization theories to your public or nonprofit organization. So 2 ways in which it would be difficult for you to just use a private organization theory and apply it to your public or nonprofit organization. But go ahead and take a break, and we'll come back at 7:35, and then I'll create the groups, and we will do some group work. All righty? Okay, I'll see you in about 15 minutes. Okay, welcome back from break. Let me go ahead. It's 7:35, so let me set up our groups, and we will go about doing that. So, like I said, I will do 4 groups. So about 4 or 5 in each group. I'll just do automatic assignments. So, okay, the groups are created. So I'll go ahead and send you in your groups. Again, you've got your task on the screen identifying 2 reasons why a private organization theory might not fit well in your public or nonprofit organization. If each group could select a spokesperson, because we're going to spend about half an hour on this, then we'll reconvene as a class, and then each group will share out what you came up with. And so please do select a spokesperson. I'll also check in on the groups when there's about 5 minutes left and give you a 5-minute warning, then give you a 2-minute warning, and then close up the rooms with about a minute left. So that's how we'll do it. So let me go ahead and open up the rooms, and then you can go into your assigned room. All right, rooms are now open. So go into your assigned room. We'll spend about half an hour on this and then reconvene. I think that everyone should be cycling back in just a second. So, okay. I think everyone's back in the main room. So let's go ahead and see what each group came up with. Hopefully you selected a spokesperson for each room. So let's start out with room number 1.
Okay, that's me. So after our discussion, our 2 characteristics that seem to kind of apply to all of our agencies, even though we work for different kinds of public agencies. The first and kind of main one that we talked a lot about was the fact that profit maximization is not the primary goal of our entities. So that really is going to change the way we operate, what our goals are, and then how we kind of reach those. And it makes it hard to kind of apply any one theory to an entire organization because of that. And then along similar lines in terms of like objectives, we also talked about how a lot of our agencies, and especially like the larger agencies where you have all these different departments, they all have differing objectives, which is also going to make it really difficult just to even apply a singular theory to that agency as a whole. Like, for example, I work for a city and I'm in Parks and Rec. So obviously our goals are a lot more specific to like meeting the needs of the community, providing services, things like that. Whereas like the goals of our economic development department are going to be very different. So it makes it really hard to apply even just one theory to our whole organization.
Sure. Great. Thank you, Amanda. Appreciate that. And yeah, the profit motivation, as we've talked about before in previous course, is that it's a necessary difference, but it's not a sufficient difference. And so, absolutely, that not having that profit motive is certainly going to mean that you have a different goal than you might have if you're a private sector corporation. And when you look at those private sector models, most of those private sector models are based upon the two E's of efficiency and effectiveness. And effectiveness is usually defined by enhancing that profit margin. And I think that you also make a very good point that when you're looking at a large organization like a city, different departments, different divisions, different units can certainly have their own sets of goals and objectives. And so you have this multiplicity of goals. And so it's difficult to say as a city, this is the one goal we're trying to achieve when all of your departments have different specific goals and objectives. So very good. All right. Thank you, Amanda. Appreciate it. And we'll do room number 2. I think room 2 is Alexa, Claudia, Esmeralda, Heidi, and Sandra are room number 2.
Oh, I apologize. I thought we were 4. This is Heidi. So we spoke about within the public sector, the process of onboarding is far more complex. So, for example, there are different requirements that are established. There's usually more documentation, tracking. Usually the process is a lot longer. And so when, for example, there's positions to be filled, that specific process is different. So, there's an applicant pool and they have to meet certain requirements. Perhaps they have to go through background checking, etc. And we also talked about how the budget sometimes limits the onboarding process. For example, in many of our organizations, right now we're being affected by the state budget. And so sometimes when there are positions to be filled, we cannot fill them because the budget doesn't allow them, versus in the private sector, that would work much differently. We also talked about what motivates employees or how to incentivize employees is different. In the private sector, you have a lot of flexibility in how you can incentivize employees. There isn't a regular schedule of when your salary can increase. That could be based solely on merit. For example, also, there's not the flexibility of bonuses, for example, like the financial part of motivation. We even were discussing amongst ourselves, and me personally within my position, when we're not allowed to accept certain gifts or gestures of kindness from families, for example, because we need to remain somewhat unbiased in our decision making, and so it's very different how we are motivated or compensated. So those are the 2 examples that we came up with.
Great. Thank you, Heidi. And it's going to be really interesting to see how organizations here in California, public sector organizations, respond to what happens in the May revise, because we do have this, looming state budget deficit that we're going to see what happens in the May revise. What are some of the programmatic impacts of that massive budget deficit? And so, yeah, I think the fewer resources we have, obviously, that's going to have a major impact on our ability to hire and onboard new employees. And so I think that certainly is very true. And yeah, I think that we look at all these differences between public and private sector organizations, and especially in terms of the way in which we can match our employees and the lack of control we have over employees that are career civil servants and who have these collective bargaining agreement protections, and it makes it more difficult for us to measure performance. And then, as you said, to then apply these incentives to enhance performance and enhance motivation. And the literature basically tells us, for the most part, that public sector employees are more motivated by intrinsic incentives as opposed to extrinsic incentives. And I think that's true, but I think we kind of get into what in research we call tautological reasoning, in that it's true that they're less motivated by extrinsic things such as additional pay and pay for performance, but are they less motivated by that because they don't have access to it? And I think it kind of gets this vicious cycle and this vicious circle of tautological reasoning that I think the reason why they're not as motivated by it is because it's just not really an option for them, oftentimes in the public sector. So, and in the motivation literature, there's a whole section of that motivation literature that looks at incentives and worker-based versus worker-specific versus non-worker specific incentives. And so we are extremely limited in the public sector in the types of incentives we can offer. So well done. Thank you, Heidi. Appreciate it. And I will go with room number 3. I think room number 3 is Irma, Jeremy, Lizette, Boo, and Carrie Ann.
Hi everyone, good evening. So we are group number 3. I thought for a second we were group number 4, so that's why it took me a while to respond. So we kind of touched base already in some of the key things that we were talking about as well in our group. Our main focus kind of consisted of a nonprofit organization, which is actually the organization that I work for, which is 211 LA, as you can see in my background. So one of the main differences that we noticed in on the private sector is the budgeting. So the way that my organization operates is we're focused on we could only do so much whatever we're granted for the fiscal year. So in the private sector, their main focus is more of a revenue, and and a nonprofit is like this is what we have to work with, and this is that's it, that's all we get, right? And we have to help the community whatever we are granted for the fiscal year. We also talked about the HR of a nonprofit organization versus a private, and Heidi just like took all the words out of what we discussed, so thank you, Heidi. So we were discussing about how in a nonprofit you kind of need like a paper trail in order to what is the word that I'm trying to think, release an employee. It takes time, you got to make sure that you're being covered, and versus a private organization, it's quite easier to discharge someone. Yeah, I'm having a brain fog, so any of my team members want to come to my rescue, you're more than welcome to do so at this point. I hope I didn't miss anything. No, I think we're good.
Yeah, I think you did a great job, Aaron. Thank you. And those are two very important points. And yeah, we always say, real estate, they always say it's all location, location, location. In human resource management, it's document, document, document. You do have to document everything and show if there is subpar performance. You then have to show attempts at remediating that through training and development, and then new other evaluation, and so on and so on. So that is certainly a huge difference. And in terms of the resources, you're right. It's interesting when you look at public versus private versus nonprofit, the sources of revenue and resources will have a big impact upon how those organizations relate with their external environment. And so in the private sector, obviously, a source of resources will be from sales and from consumers. So, that's going to be their source. Whereas in nonprofit organizations, the source will be grants, and writing grants and getting grants from granting organizations. And then the public sector, it's usually appropriations. And so you have different areas of focus in your external environment. And when you're working in a nonprofit organization and you're funded primarily through grants, sometimes there's a lot more heterogeneity, if you will, and a lot more variation to those sources of those grants than if you're reliant upon appropriations in the public sector. That the appropriations that you get will be very similar this year as to what you got last year, unless you got a major budget crisis, but it'll just be a small incremental change. And so there's a lot of stability to those appropriations in the public sector, less stability when you're based upon grants in the nonprofit sector, and very little stability when you're based upon consumer preferences in the private sector. And so the stability versus lack of stability can certainly have a major impact upon your focus on efficiency. And so, there's a heightened focus on efficiency sometimes in the private sector because the source of revenue is so volatile. If you're not efficient, you're obviously going to go out of business. If you're in the public sector, your appropriations are much more stable. So there's much less of an incentive sometimes to be highly efficient in public organizations. And so I think that's a really good point and a really good distinction between the different sectors. So perfect. Thank you very much, Irma. Appreciate it. And we'll go to room number 4. I think that was our small room. So I think we only have 4 folks in there.
Hello, everyone, for group 4. So we talked a little bit similar as the other groups as far as just with respect to the civil service system and the time that it takes to onboard staffing versus the private sector, where you don't really have those timing constraints and those processes where you have to try to work more to give a competitive process, and then within the promotional systems. But since everyone pretty much talked about that, the other areas that we did talked about was just the public scrutiny and transparency that public sectors tend to be under with respect to just procurement processes and just day-to-day work with our Public Records Act, where there's this big emphasis on transparency for the public, where everyone wants to see everything. So we have to build in those extra processes to ensure we're being great key holders to our government dollars and just being accountable to our constituents. And then another area where we did focus on is just the politics, the difference of being a public agency, being accountable to our elected officials who typically have a different perspective, agenda, and initiatives compared to a private entity who is typically, I think the professor, or you did discuss it, where it's more profit driven, where a short-term profit driven based on the market and specific objectives, where public tends to be long-term and just based on the initiatives of the elected body at the time. So those are.
So thank you, Dana. Very well done. And those are all important points. And yeah, I just want to quickly pick up on that second point, the idea of transparency. I think that is so incredibly important for public organizations, that so much of what we do is subject to a public records request. And the laws that we have here in California in terms of Public Records Act really open up a lot of our communications to scrutiny by the public. And that's a good thing. Obviously, there's a reason why that is there in government code, but it also takes up a lot of time and takes up a lot of resources. And if you've ever had to deal with PRA requests, just how much time and how many resources it can consume to be responsive, because you have to be responsive within 10 days, unless there's a good reason why you can't be responsive in 10 days. And sometimes it means you're tracking down emails on servers from 8, 9, 10 years ago that are responsive to this public records request. And so obviously that's going to have an impact then upon how you allocate your resources, going to have an impact upon your efficiency, and sometimes obviously have an impact upon your effectiveness as well. That type of transparency, that type of scrutiny is clearly something that's not such an imperative in the private sector. And so in a private organization, you might be able to dedicate your resources to enhancing your profits, while in the public sector, some of your resources are going to go toward responding to these requests and this public scrutiny. Again, it's not a bad thing. I'm not saying it's a bad thing to have that. I'm just saying it's a reality to understanding how we allocate our resources at time in the public sector. So I'm very glad, Group 4, that you mentioned that, because I think that is a very important point. I do think it's growing in significance as well. I know my last few years on the school board, our number of public records requests just increased exponentially in those, especially the last 2 years I was on the board. And it was just taking a tremendous amount of time for the district to track down anything that would be responsive then to those requests. So excellent points. I think all 4 groups made very good points. So thank you very much for that. Hopefully, as a result of tonight's session, we have now provided a strong justification for why we study public organizations differently than private sector organizations. We hopefully have provided a justification for having a course such as this in the MPA program. And then also hopefully we've provided a little bit of insight into how we are going to proceed over the next several weeks in analyzing and comparing our theories with those models of effectiveness, with the mechanisms for control and coordination, and with those methods, mechanisms for motivating our employees. And so that's something we're going to return to every single week as we talk about each one of our schools and each one of our theories. So what we've done now is we have set the stage then for next week. We will get into classic organization theory. A lot of these authors that you have talked about before in 500, but we're going to again delve deeper into them and really get into some of the nuts and bolts of those theories, and then how those theories apply in our modern day organization. So next week will be classic organization theory. Do remember to do Canvas essay number 1 and 2 responses to classmates, introducing your organization that you're going to be using for your organizational analysis, and then the purpose and functions of that organization. All righty. That's all I have for you tonight. So we're going to finish up a little bit early tonight. Are there any questions or anything before we part ways for this evening? Okay. If anything emerges, send me an email. Otherwise, I look forward to reading your Canvas essay post, and also look forward to seeing you then again next Monday, where we will talk about classic organization theory. So thanks, everyone. Have a great week, and I'll talk to you next Monday.
Thank you.
Have a good night,
Thank you.
everyone.
Have a good
Thank
night.
you. Good night.
Thank
Good
you.
night.